I'd like to discuss some drum tuning troubleshooting tips. For example, wrinkles in the drum head, excess overtones or rings, or maybe getting too much snare buzz when you're playing the toms. So let's begin with wrinkles in the drum heads. So let's take a look at the 12-inch drum. Now, let's say that I get a brand new drum head, put it on, seat it, stretch it, snug up the tension rods, and begin to tune it. All of a sudden I notice there's a ripple or a wrinkle in the drum head. The obvious solution would be to take my drum key, turn the tension rods until the ripple smooths out. Now, a lot of the times, that's all you need to do. Sometimes it doesn't work. You might be going, wow, wait a second, I see this big massive ripple in the drum head, and I start to tune it, but I don't want to get too high, okay, as far as the pitch goes. So if it's a good drum head and you tighten it up and the wrinkle goes away and the drum head sounds too high, simply you can just lower the tuning of the bottom head to compensate for what you did on the top for the tension here. Now, sometimes that doesn't even work. Now, hopefully you'll never encounter this, but you might put on a brand new drum head, do the exact same thing I just discussed, and there's still a wrinkle no matter what you do. Believe it or not, it could be a defective drum head. If that's the case, go back to your local music retailer, explain the situation, and they should replace it for you. Come back home with your brand new drum head, put it on. Let's hope the problem is solved. Might be a defective drum head. If you notice the exact same problem, you might unfortunately have a warped drum. This is where it gets a little tricky to fix, because once the drum is warped, you're not really going to get it back into a perfect round shape. So you might have to deal with that warp unless you can find a way to replace that drum. So if you see the wrinkle in the head, just try what I mentioned. Tighten it up, see if it works for you. Most cases it will. Okay, so let me show you how to eliminate or reduce any snare drum excess buzz or sizzle from the bottom snare wires. So let me turn on the snare and hit it so you can hear how this sounds. So as you can hear, there's quite a bit of excess sizzle coming from my snare drum. Now my snare drum is in tune. I haven't changed anything since the previous excerpts. So what I'm going to simply do is I'm just going to hit the snare drum and slowly turn the little knob on the strainer in a tightening position so you can hear the change in the snare wires. So as you can see, I've eliminated any excess snare sizzle that I didn't want simply by turning the little knob on the strainer. Now, you might have a snare drum at home that you're trying this with. If it seems really hard to turn, the only thing you need is a little dab of oil, WD-40 or something like that, to make it turn easier. Now, if you find that you're turning it and it's turning easy and it stops, don't force it because that means that's as far as it's going to go. If you still have the snare sizzle happening, all that means is that you need to tighten up the strings on the bottom that hold the snare wire. It could be a plastic strap, it could be a little mylar strap or some sort of a leather strap holding the snare wires to the bottom of the head on either side with the strainers. So all you need to do is completely reduce all the slack off of the snare wires just by loosening the knob on the strainer. Then you have to loosen the snare wires either with a drum key or a screwdriver. Reduce some slack so the snare wires are going to hang down a bit. Tighten it back up, and then start tightening the knob on your strainer. Then you'll notice that you have more play to use with the snare wires, so they're going to actually come back up to the bottom of the head, and you'll probably reduce that. Now, if that doesn't happen still, you're going to have to resort to some muffling. You might have to put some moon gel or drum gum on the top head. You might have to put some on the bottom head. Only problem with the bottom head sometimes is because there's so much vibration on the bottom head, the muffling can tend to fall off. So you might have to put a piece of tape or even tape a piece of moon gel to the bottom just to see if that works. One thing I wouldn't suggest doing that I've seen, I used to do some repairs years ago, and I'd see guys putting tape right over top of their snare wires. And don't do that because you don't have the option to turn it off and on, and it's not actually working properly with the strainer. So don't do that. Just do what you can to get rid of any excess snare buzz. A lot of times it could be tuning, so be sure to experiment with that. Another challenge that comes up for drummers is when they hit their toms, the snare starts to buzz or ring. How do we reduce that? Well, I know we can reduce it. Eliminating it seems to be impossible unless we actually turn the snare wires completely off, which is not how we want to play the snare in most scenarios. Let me give you an example of what I mean, just in case you're not clear. So as you can see, I'm not even hitting the snare drum, I'm hitting the tom, and the bottom snare wires are rattling. It's simply because there's sound traveling through the air, through the drum, rattling the bottom wires. Now, believe it or not, this is pretty reduced, the sound that you heard, because I have my snare wires really tight from the previous example. If I loosen the snare wires and hit the tom again, listen now. So you saw that the looser the snare wires were, the more buzz I had. Now keep in mind, I didn't hit the snare drum at all. So let's go back to tightening it up again. And I want to make sure my snare still sounds good. I don't want to jeopardize the sound of my snare to eliminate some buzz because in a live setting, no one's going to hear that anyways. In the studio, it can be reduced as well because you have individual mics, but I found it very hard to eliminate completely. So let me just tighten up the snare wires again. Hit the snare to make sure I still like the sound of the snare drum. Now I'll hit the tom to see if it's reduced the snare wire sizzle. Now let's see if putting some muffling on the snare drum makes much of a difference. So you can see it made a little bit of a difference, but not a lot. You just kind of got to get used to the actual sound of the drum ringing when it's on. It's not a bad thing. If it's really excess, tighten the snare bottom, tighten the strainer, make sure the drums are in perfect tune or as good as you can get them, and it'll reduce it so you won't be going crazy with the sound always buzzing in your face. So experiment with that.